In the fall of 1889, the Ozark Mountains in Missouri were wild land where civilization was just a distant whisper and law came late. Families lived in this area, which is known for its dense forests and remote valleys, completely cut off from the outside world. The Brooks family ran a small inn along the trail that connected Springfield to settlements in the south. They offered shelter to the few travelers who were brave enough to cross those dangerous lands. People knew Brooks Inn for two things: Della Brooks's warm hospitality and the strange way that guests would just disappear without a trace. People thought these absences were due to the area's natural dangers, like bears, wolves, dangerous ravines, and bandits who attacked people traveling alone. But when Marshal Rodney Clark got to that property in November, after following clues about missing people, he would find out that the real predators weren't the wild animals in the mountains. The horror he found at that remote farm would lead him to one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard. A family that turned hospitality into a deadly trap. The Brooks property was about 80 acres of hilly land, and it had a main log house, a small barn, and some other buildings spread out across it. In 1887, Ezra Brooks inherited the land from his father. At the time, it still had some cows and pigs, which were important for the family's survival and for the inn's kitchen, which was a stop for the few travelers who crossed the Ozarks. Brooks Inn was one of the few civilized places to stay in an area where the next house could be days away. These few places were the only ones that travelers could count on to help them get through the wild mountains safely. The first few months were enough to stay alive. Della Brooks was a strong 28-year-old woman with brown hair that she always wore in a simple kerchief. She could cook basic meals. The few merchants who traveled through the mountains knew about her simple stews, which provided a hot meal in the middle of nowhere. Ezra was 32 years old, thin, and had an unkempt beard. His hands were rough from working on the farm. He took care of the property and the small herd they owned. Ezra and his wife didn't have any kids, but Ezra's younger brother John sometimes helped them with the harder work on the property. He also knew the area's remote trails very well. John Brooks, 26, was a man with a bad temper who had run-ins with the law in other towns. After some trouble in Springfield, he had gone to live on his brother's property, and he had stayed there for good. John was familiar with every path and hiding place in the mountains near the property. In the harsh winter of 1888, things got a lot worse. A series of terrible storms hit the area, killing most of the Brooks cattle and destroying the main barn. The losses were terrible for a business that was already struggling, and the family was left with no way to recover. There were new problems in the spring. A disease hit the rest of the herd and killed almost all of the animals that were still alive. Ezra tried hard to save what was left, but he didn't know what he was doing and didn't have the right tools, so he lost almost everything. In just a few weeks, the farm was down to a few sickly chickens. The Springfield merchants started to owe money. The Brooks were stuck in a downward spiral of poverty, because they didn't have the money to buy basic supplies or animals to kill. They watched their property get worse while trying to keep up appearances for the few guests who still came. During this time of crisis, the way things worked at Brooks Inn changed in a big way. The few notes Della kept in a plain notebook started to show strange patterns. People who came for one night just vanished, leaving no luggage behind and no sign of them on the trail. The first known case happened in June. A tool dealer came to the inn during a storm, but no one ever saw him leave. When someone in Springfield asked about him, the Brooks said he had left early the next morning, eager to continue his journey. In the summer and fall, the same thing happened again and again. Lone travelers, rich merchants, and even some settlers looking for land all came to Brooks Inn and then just vanished. The Brooks always said the same thing. The guests left early, before dawn. The local community, which was mostly made up of farmers who lived far apart, didn't question these explanations at first. The Ozarks were known for being dangerous because of bandits, wild animals, and rough terrain that made it easy for inexperienced travelers to go missing. During this time, some people who were watching the inn noticed small changes in how it worked. Della kept serving meat stews to her guests, even though there were supposedly no animals to kill. When asked where the meat came from, she vaguely said that she got small amounts by hunting or trading from time to time. During this time of crisis, the quality of the stews stayed the same. The few guests who were there said that the food was good and that it filled them up after long trips. Della's cooking skills earned her praise, and her reputation spread among the few travelers who came to the area. Ezra was more and more withdrawn and angry. Some of his neighbors noticed that he didn't want to talk to them and seemed on edge all the time when they asked him about the farm's business. His hands started to shake a little, and the shaking got worse when he talked about guests. John was even harder to find. He would go missing for days in the mountains and come back with vague excuses about checking the trails or hunting. He didn't come by as often, but he always showed up when there was a lot of work to be done. During this time, the three of them got into a strict routine. Della was in charge of the kitchen and guest service, and Ezra was in charge of keeping the property in good shape. John stayed in the background, avoiding direct contact with visitors. But he was always there when he was needed. There were also big changes to the property itself. Ezra and John worked on outbuildings behind the main house, but they never rebuilt the barn that was destroyed. Neighbors sometimes heard work sounds coming from that direction, but the brothers said they were just fixing things and putting tools away. Even though it was thought that Brooks Inn didn't have enough money, it was financially stable for a while in late summer. Della was able to pay off some of her debts to the Springfield merchant and even fix up the main house a little. When asked, she said that hard work and being careful with money were the reasons for her success. There were new problems in the fall. Merchants who traveled through the area from time to time started to say that their friends had disappeared after saying they were going to stop at Brooks Inn. People said these first worries in a casual way, without any specific suspicions. A merchant in Springfield told the local marshal in October that his business partner had gone missing after going on a trip that included a stop at Brooks Inn. The merchant didn't think his friend was guilty of a crime, but he was worried about his health. The local marshal thought the worry was just a normal thing at first, because he was busy with other cases and knew about the area's natural dangers. He said he would look into it when he had time, but he didn't think it was an urgent matter because the area was so dangerous. But even though everything looked normal, there were still disturbing signs that kept showing up. Neighbors saw that even though guests came and went from time to time, they almost never saw the same people leave the property. The Brooks said that this was because most travelers left very early, before their neighbors were awake. The pattern of people going missing had become so regular that some experienced merchants started to stay away from Brooks Inn. Instead, they chose to camp outside or take longer routes to find other places to stay. These business people didn't have any real proof, but their gut told them something was wrong. By late autumn, the Brooks had fully changed from struggling innkeepers to something much more darker. What had started as a desperate fight for survival had turned into a pattern that would soon get the attention of the authorities and change how people thought about safety in remote Ozark inns forever. Temperance Lancaster's arrival at Brooks Inn on the night of November 15th went as planned for rural hospitality. The storm that made the stagecoach look for shelter got worse as the afternoon went on, making it unsafe to travel on the mountain trails. Samuel Wright, the experienced coachman who drove the route between Springfield and the southern settlements, wisely chose to stay at the inn until the weather got better. He knew how dangerous the trails could be during storms, and he knew that trying to keep going would be too risky for his passengers. Ezra Brooks greeted the travelers at the door with the usual politeness for the area. He helped take the bags off the bus and gave them a place to stay for the night. Della, his wife, came out of the kitchen to greet the guests. She wiped her hands on her apron and offered them hot tea to warm them up. Brooks Inn had all the features of a simple country inn. The rooms were basic but clean, with straw beds and sinks for washing up. The fireplace crackled and warmed the common area, and the smell of cooking food came from the kitchen, promising a hot meal after a long day of travel. About an hour after they got there, another traveler showed up looking for a place to stay. Tom Mitchell, a cowboy in his 30s, was surprised by how bad the weather got while he was driving a small herd of cattle to a farm in Arkansas. Tom Mitchell was an experienced trail rider who was known for being good with horses and knowing the best ways to get around the Ozarks. He rode a unique bay horse that was well taken care of and clearly loved by its owner. Mitchell named the horse Diamond because it had a white mark on its forehead that looked like a diamond. The three travelers talked about their trips over dinner. Mitchell said that he worked moving cows between farms in the area and doing seasonal work. He was friendly and spoke clearly. He told stories about his time on the trail and gave tips on the best ways to get to different places. Temperance Lancaster was especially interested in Mitchell's horse. She praised the horse and asked about its traits. Mitchell answered with obvious pride, saying that he had raised the horse from a colt and that it was known for being tough and having a calm temperament on tough trails. Della's meal lived up to its reputation for big portions. The stew was thick and tasty, and it filled up the hungry travelers after a long day. Mitchell said the food was so good that it was worth going out of his way to try Della's cooking. The atmosphere at dinner was warm and friendly, which is what you would expect from rural hospitality. After dinner, the guests went to their simple rooms. Temperance saw that her window gave her a partial view of the back of the property, but it was hard to see because it was dark and raining all the time. She could barely make out the shapes of the ruined barn and the spot where Mitchell had left Diamond. Temperance heard noises from outside at night that bothered her from time to time. There were low voices and people moving around, which made the sound seem louder than it would be during a normal storm. The noises kept coming and going for several hours, and some of them sounded like they were coming from the outbuildings behind the property. The storm had calmed down by the next morning, but it was still raining hard enough to make travel uncomfortable and possibly dangerous on muddy trails. Samuel Wright thought it would be smart to wait a few more hours to see if things would get better before continuing the trip. Temperance asked about Tom Mitchell at breakfast, thinking he would be at the common table. Della said that the cowboy had left very early that morning, before dawn, because he was eager to continue his journey despite the bad weather. She said that Mitchell had told her he knew the trails well and had important things to do that required him to get there on time. The explanation made sense, since experienced cowboys often traveled in conditions that most people would think were not good enough. Samuel Wright, on the other hand, said that it was strange for someone to leave so early during a storm, especially when they could have stayed in a comfortable place. Temperance was in her room later that morning, when it was still raining. She saw something moving in the back of the property. She could clearly see a bay horse grazing near the outbuildings through the window. It looked exactly like Diamond, right down to the white mark that she had noticed the night before. Temperance was upset by what she found and called Samuel Wright to confirm what she had seen. Wright looked at the horse through the window and confirmed that it was definitely the same horse that Tom Mitchell had brought. There was no doubt about the identification. The horse's presence made it clear that the claim that Mitchell had left early that morning was wrong. Wright thought it was impossible for an experienced cowboy to leave his horse behind, especially one that Mitchell had talked about with such pride, and that was so important to his work. Temperance and Wright became more and more worried as they saw the obvious contradiction and the strange nature of the situation. They started to understand that something was very wrong, but they chose not to confront the Brooks directly because they were afraid for their own safety. Instead, Wright quietly told Temperance that they should leave as soon as possible and get help from the police in Springfield. The strange presence of Diamond, along with the claim that Mitchell had left without his most prized horse, made it necessary for the authorities to look into the matter. Temperance and Wright made the decision to leave Brooks Inn right away. They quietly got ready to leave without letting the Brooks know what they were thinking. Wright made up an excuse about having to go to Springfield for important work that couldn't wait, even though the weather was bad. The departure from Brooks Inn took place in a tense atmosphere that wasn't well hidden. The Brooks kept up their polite behavior, but it was clear that they didn't like being asked about Tom Mitchell. Temperance and Wright left with the intention of telling the authorities what they had seen. On the way back to Springfield, Wright and Temperance talked about what they had seen and came to the conclusion that Tom Mitchell was probably still on the Brooks property, maybe hurt or unable to move. They also thought about the more evil option, but both of them hoped they were wrong. The choice to ask the police for help was a key point in finding out about the Brooks crimes. Temperance's careful observations of Diamond and Wright's practical knowledge of how cowboys act were enough to warrant an official investigation into what was going on at the remote inn. Temperance Lancaster and Samuel Wright's worries about what was going on at Brooks Inn grew stronger as they traveled to Springfield on the afternoon of November 16th. Local authorities needed to look into the situation because Tom Mitchell's alleged departure and Diamond's presence on the property were at odds with each other. When the two visitors came to Marshal Rodney Clark's office with their disturbing news, he was there. Clark, a 48-year-old man who had worked in law enforcement in the area for 15 years, was initially doubtful about the claims. The community thought highly of Brooks Inn. Clark had seen Tom Mitchell before, because the cowboy sometimes came through Springfield on his work trips. People knew Mitchell as a dependable and experienced man who was always on time and took care of his work. The marshal's attention was drawn right away by Wright's description of the strange behavior. Clark could confirm Diamond's identity by looking at the detailed description, which included the unique white mark. Temperance stressed how impressed she had been with the animal, which made her identification beyond doubt. Clark thought that the situation called for a trip to Brooks Inn to check on Tom Mitchell's well-being and clear things up. He put together a small team, which included his deputy, Harold Stevens, to help him with the investigation. It was decided to treat the situation as a simple check. Clark and Stevens left for Brooks Inn on the morning of November 17th. After a few hours of riding through mountain trails, they got there around noon. Ezra Brooks greeted them, but he seemed upset when the officers told him why they were there. Brooks said that Tom Mitchell had stayed at the inn, but he still said that the cowboy had left early the next morning. When Clark asked about Diamond, Ezra gave the same answer he had given before. Mitchell left the animal to rest, but when Clark asked him directly, his answer didn't seem as convincing. Clark noticed that the story didn't match how regional cowboys usually act. The explanation seemed less and less likely, as experienced cowboys just didn't leave their horses behind, especially valuable ones. Della Brooks joined the conversation and agreed with her husband's version of how Mitchell left. She went into more detail about how Mitchell had talked about important commitments, but Clark noticed small differences in their stories that made them seem overly worried about something that should have been normal. Clark asked for permission to look around the room where Mitchell had stayed, saying that he needed to make sure the cowboy hadn't left anything behind. The Brooks didn't want to agree at first, saying that the room had already been cleaned and set up for new guests. The room looked like it had been cleaned recently and completely, which is more than what would be normal for a normal guest turnover. Clark saw that there were no signs of recent activity or personal items, which seemed strange, since Mitchell had supposedly left just one day before. Clark saw Diamond grazing behind the house while he was looking at the property. Wright and Temperance's descriptions of the animal were spot on. Clark said that a cowboy would never leave behind such a valuable animal. Stevens searched the buildings and outbuildings behind the property for signs of Mitchell or anything that could help explain where he was. The first search didn't find any clear evidence, but the main question stayed the same. Why would an experienced cowboy leave his most prized horse behind? Stevens saw that one of the outbuildings had been used recently and had strange changes made to it while they were looking for it. The Brooks said they were making repairs and reorganizing tools, so the inside was different from how it was originally used. The explanation made sense, but the way the space was set up didn't seem right. The investigation of the property didn't give clear answers, but the Brooks story didn't add up, and Diamond's presence was strange enough to raise enough suspicions to warrant a deeper look. Before making any decisions about what to do next, Clark decided to ask around in town. Clark decided to do some quiet research on the Brooks' business activities when he got back to Springfield. He knew that if they were really taking personal items as payment, they might have tried to sell or trade them in town. He went to Abraham Tessman's general store first. It was the only store in town that sometimes bought valuable personal items. Tessman, a seasoned businessman who kept simple records of his sales, said that the Brooks had been customers from time to time in the past few months. They had sold a lot of personal things, like watches, lockets, and rings. Tessman thought the items belonged to guests who couldn't pay their bills in cash, which was common in the area where money was tight and trades were common. Clark was surprised by how often the transactions happened. Tessman said that the couple had been selling personal items on a regular basis in the past few months, using his simple notes as a guide. The wide range of items suggested a steady source of income that was more than what would be expected from occasional guest payments. Tessman showed some things that were still in his store that he had bought from the Brooks in the past few weeks. A silver locket and a plain chain were among the things. There were no specific names on any of the items, but they were all things that travelers would normally carry and would hardly leave behind on purpose. The merchant said that it was his habit to always ask where the items came from. The Brooks always said that the items came from guests who had left without being able to pay their full bills and had left the items as collateral or payment. Clark wanted to know how many things the Brooks had sold and how much they were worth. Tessman thought that the couple had sold things worth several dozen dollars in the last few months. This was more than what would be expected from a small rural inn. Clark had real proof that something was wrong at Brooks Inn when he found out that people were often buying things at the general store. The Brooks were selling too many personal items and too many of the wrong kinds for normal guest payments to explain. Clark also stopped by the local merchant who supplied the area without an appointment. The merchant said that the Brooks had gotten better at paying their bills in the last few months and had paid off old debts that had built up over the winter. Even though the information wasn't very specific, it showed that the Brooks had made a financial recovery that didn't seem to match what you'd expect from a small, rural inn. The combination of this information and what was found at the general store made a pattern that needed to be explained. Clark decided that there was enough evidence from the general store and inconsistencies seen on the Brooks property to warrant a more thorough investigation. The strange presence of diamond and the pattern of personal object sales made for a disturbing picture. Clark put together a bigger group to go back to Brooks Inn the next morning. He added 2 more deputies and made plans to bring tools that might be needed to search the property more thoroughly. The evidence that was gathered pointed to the Brooks being involved in illegal activities. Finding transactions at the general store was a key turning point in the investigation. It showed that the Brooks were regularly selling valuable personal items, and there were also conflicting stories about Tom Mitchell. This created a pattern that couldn't be explained by normal activities. Clark also sent messages to other marshals in nearby towns to see if they had heard of any travelers who had gone missing and might have passed through the Brooks Inn area. Even though he didn't expect quick answers, this message could give him more information. The main piece of evidence was still the big lie about Tom Mitchell, an experienced cowboy who was said to have left his most prized horse. This inconsistency, along with the pattern of selling personal items, raised enough suspicions to warrant a full search. Clark knew that the investigation the next day would be very important in finding out if his suspicions were correct, or if there were innocent reasons for the patterns he had seen. The evidence that has been gathered so far is circumstantial, but it is serious enough to warrant a full investigation. Clark's return to Brooks Inn on November 18th was the start of the most troubling part of his investigation. The marshal was ready to do a full search with evidence from Springfield and 3 deputies. This search would finally reveal the truth about the disappearances in the Ozark region. The team got to the property early in the morning and saw that the Brooks family was doing what looked like normal farm work. Clark, on the other hand, quickly saw signs of recent trouble around the property. Freshly turned earth in a few places and a strange smell coming from the outbuildings behind the main house. Ezra Brooks looked nervous when the police officers came to see him. His hands shook a little as he tried to act like he was cooperating. When Clark said he was going to search the whole property, Ezra went from being nervous and cooperative to barely hiding his panic. Della Brooks came out of the kitchen with an apron that looked like it had blood and other things on it. When asked about the stains, she quickly said that she had been processing chickens to keep them fresh, but the amount and type of stains didn't seem to match how chickens are usually prepared. Clark chose to start the search with the outbuildings. especially the modified structure that Deputy Stevens had seen on the last visit. As the team got closer to the building, the strange smell got stronger. It was a sickly sweet smell that experienced police officers immediately recognized as coming from something that was rotting. It was strange for a simple storage building to have a heavy wooden bar on the door. Ezra Brooks got more and more upset when Clark told him to open the door. He said that the building only had farm tools and supplies that didn't need to be checked. The search team found something inside the outbuilding that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The building had been turned into what could only be called a processing facility, with tables, cutting tools, and drainage systems that were clearly meant for something much worse than regular farm work. There were a lot of blood stains on the inside, and the smell of death was too strong. Deputy Stevens found human remains that had been processed in different ways, which confirmed the team's worst fears about what the Brooks family was really doing. The proof was clear and terrible. Clark found personal items among the remains that could be linked to Tom Mitchell, such as his unique belt buckle and a pocket watch that matched what people who had known the missing cowboy had said about him. The discovery proved that Mitchell really did die at Brooks Inn. More research into the processing facility showed that there were more than one victim. The Brooks family had been killing guests on purpose for months, as shown by the clothing, jewelry, and other items found at their home. The crimes they committed were much worse than anyone thought. As the search went on, Deputy Harold Stevens saw smoke coming from a wooded area about 200 yards behind the main buildings. When he looked into it, he found John Brooks trying to burn what looked like more evidence, like clothes and personal papers belonging to different people. As soon as John tried to destroy the evidence, he was caught. His clothes were covered in blood and other things, and his actions showed that he was very upset and guilty. When asked about the things he was burning, he first said he was getting rid of old farm waste. Several letters and documents with the names of missing people who had been reported in different communities in the area were among the things John was trying to burn. One of these letters belonged to a Kansas City merchant who had gone missing 2 months earlier while traveling through the Ozarks. John Brooks was the first family member to break down and admit to the crimes after being questioned very hard. His confession showed how terrible the family's business was and gave important information about how they chose and got rid of their victims. John's confession said that the family had been going after people who were traveling alone and looked like they had money or valuable things. They would kill these guests while they were staying there, process the bodies in the converted outbuilding, and hide the evidence in different places on their property. The confession included disturbing details about how the family had been using parts of human remains as meat in meals served to later guests. This new information made their crimes even worse, because it meant that innocent travelers had eaten human flesh without knowing it while staying at the inn. John said that his older brother, Ezra, had mostly planned the operation, while Della had been in charge of cooking the meals that included human remains. He said that he didn't want to take part but was forced to by threats and family pressure. The confession gave specific information about at least 7 people who had been killed at Brooks Inn since June. But John's knowledge was not complete, and he thought that the total number of victims might be higher because Ezra and Della were more directly involved in choosing and killing them. Clark told everyone to search the whole property in an organized way to find burial sites and other evidence. The team started digging in places where victims' bodies were said to have been buried after being processed in the converted outbuilding, using information from John's confession. The digging uncovered several burial sites with human remains that were at different stages of decay. Personal items found with the bodies helped identify a number of victims, including a Kansas City merchant and 2 other travelers whose families had reported them missing in the last few months. Ezra Brooks finally admitted to organizing and carrying out the murders after seeing a lot of physical evidence and John's detailed confession. His confession showed how planned their operation was and the ways they had come up with to avoid being caught. Ezra said that the family had started the killing spree because they were desperate after losing all their money, but they kept doing it because they found out how much money they could make. Over time, they got better at covering up their crimes and keeping up the appearance of being legitimate hosts. At first, Della Brooks tried to deny being involved by saying she didn't know what her husband and brother-in-law were up to. However, the evidence from the kitchen and her clear knowledge of the processing facility made it impossible for her to keep claiming she was innocent. Della eventually admitted to making meals with human flesh and serving them to guests who didn't know what they were eating after being questioned more than once. Her confession showed just how bad the family was and filled in the last pieces of the puzzle about their operation. The investigation showed that the Brooks family had come up with a complicated way to choose victims, kill them, deal with their bodies, and get rid of the evidence. They had planned their operation to make it less likely that they would be caught while making the most money from their crimes. Clark's careful research had uncovered one of the most horrible criminal activities in the area's history: the murder, cannibalism, and breaking of basic rules of hospitality made this case shocking to people in Missouri and beyond. There was too much evidence found during the search to deny. The processing facility had personal items, human remains, detailed confessions, and physical evidence that made it impossible for any of the Brooks family members to get away with it. Clark made sure that all 3 family members were safely taken to the county jail in Springfield, where they would wait for their trial on multiple murder charges. The evidence gathered would be used in what was likely to be one of the most important criminal cases in Missouri's history. The Brooks Inn was quickly closed off as a crime scene, and Clark set up more searches to make sure that all the evidence was properly collected and recorded. Law enforcement would keep an eye on the property until the family had finished their legal case. People in the area were shocked and didn't believe the news of the arrests and the crimes that had happened. They had trusted the Brooks family's hospitality, The case would change how people who traveled to the Ozark region stayed in remote places forever. During that winter, the trial of the Brooks family got a lot of attention in Greene County. The strange crimes that were discovered drew people from nearby farms and settlements, turning Springfield's courthouse into a very interesting place during the weeks of court proceedings. Clark showed carefully organized evidence that made the Brooks' criminal operation look very real. The bloody tools from the processing cabin, the victim's personal items found on the property, and the confessions from all three family members made a case that couldn't be disputed. The public prosecutor talked about how the family had been running a murder business for the last 5 months. The news that unsuspecting guests had eaten human flesh without knowing it made people in the rustic courthouse in Springfield feel sick and horrified. At first, the case was about 3 victims who were last seen in the Brooks Inn area, one of whom was Tom Mitchell. As the trial went on and news of the case slowly spread through the area, some families from far away came looking for missing loved ones. Della Brooks showed more and more signs of mental stress during the second week of the trial. Her husband and brother-in-law's testimonies, along with physical evidence, slowly wore down her initial resistance. She gave more information about how the family chose and dealt with their victims. Della's confession included how she cooked meals with human flesh in them, mixing it with game meat and strong spices to hide the taste difference. People in the courthouse were shocked when she said that she had knowingly served this meat to innocent guests. Ezra Brooks tried to downplay his role by saying that he had been influenced by desperate situations and family pressure. But evidence of his direct involvement in the murders made his claims unconvincing. His actions during the investigation showed that he knew everything about the crimes and was involved in them. John Brooks acted defensively throughout the trial, trying to say that older family members had forced him to take part. But he was clearly aware that what he was doing was illegal because he was in charge of the processing cabin and tried to destroy evidence. As the trial went on and more information came to light, it became clear how many crimes the Brooks had committed. Testimonies showed that 3 people had definitely been victims of the family during the 5 months they were in business. But there was only physical evidence for these 3 victims because of how they got rid of the bodies. The trial showed how the Brooks chose their victims. They liked travelers who were alone and didn't have many visible family ties, especially those who were carrying money or other valuable items. Because they chose carefully, they were able to run their business for months without raising any red flags. Some of the evidence included personal items taken from Tom Mitchell and some things found on the property that families of other victims could recognize. The family had sold most of the victims' things, but these few things that were still around were very important pieces of evidence. Clark talked about finding the processing cabin and how John tried to destroy evidence. He gave details that showed how carefully the crimes were planned and carried out. His description of the bloody tools and body parts that were found made the courthouse feel tense. The local doctor who looked at the dead bodies on the property said they were human and had been hurt. Even though medicine wasn't very advanced at the time, his confirmation that the deaths were violent was enough to support murder charges. People who lived near the family and knew them testified about strange things they had seen them do in the months leading up to the investigation. Their reports of strange nighttime activity, a bad smell coming from the property, and the Brooks' increasingly angry behavior were all important pieces of information that helped to establish the criminal pattern. Families of possible victims gave statements about when they last saw their loved ones and their plans to travel through the area where Brooks Inn was located. Not all of the cases could be definitively linked to the Brooks, but the pattern of disappearances was convincing. Abraham Tessman, a merchant from Springfield, said that he had done business with the Brooks a lot in the last few months. He said that the couple had sold a number of personal items, like watches, lockets, and rings, and said that they were payments from guests who couldn't pay in cash. The defense tried to say that the family did what they did because they were very poor and alone, but the fact that the crimes went on for so long meant that they couldn't use that as an excuse. Evidence showed that the planning was done on purpose and the execution was done carefully. The jury, which was made up of local farmers and merchants, took 2 days to decide that all 3 Brooks family members were guilty of first-degree murder. The jury's deliberation showed how serious the charges were, and how important it was to look at all the evidence. The judge gave Ezra, Dela, and John Brooks the death penalty by hanging, which will take place in Springfield within 3 months. People who saw the sentence agreed with it without saying anything, because they knew that the crimes were so bad that the law allowed the harshest punishment. For the months after the trial, the 3 family members stayed in Springfield's simple jail, where they were waiting to be executed. Della Brooks was mostly quiet, as if she were thinking about how bad her actions were. Ezra and John, on the other hand, kept hoping for mercy. Territorial authorities turned down basic appeals because they thought the evidence was strong enough and the trial was fair. The crimes and the evidence presented did not give any reason to overturn convictions or lessen death sentences. A large number of people came to watch the executions on a cold March morning in 1890. They were there to see the end of the family that had shocked the area with their crimes. The people who came to watch were both curious and wanted to see justice done in their community. Della Brooks was the first to die, and she kept a look of resignation on her face until the end. She gave a short speech asking for forgiveness from the families of the victims, but she wouldn't say anything more about other possible crimes or where the bodies were that were never found. Ezra Brooks tried to make a final statement, saying he was truly sorry, but people who heard him were not convinced. His execution went off without a hitch, and it ended the life of a man who had been actively involved in killing innocent travelers for money. When John Brooks was about to be executed, he gave some vague information about possible places where his body might be buried, but later searches found no new evidence. There were still many questions about the exact number of victims that went unanswered. In the months after the executions, news of the case slowly spread to the more remote parts of the Ozarks. At the same time, families began to show up in Springfield, saying that their loved ones had gone missing in the area. Because of the slow communication of the time, many people didn't find out about the crimes until long after they happened. Over the next few months, about 9 different families said that relatives who had traveled through the area where Brooks Inn was located had gone missing. Authorities couldn't make any clear links between these disappearances and the Brooks crimes, though, because there was no physical evidence or witnesses. Because of how people communicated in 1890, news of the crimes didn't reach faraway towns and cities until weeks or even months after they happened. Many families who had lost touch with relatives who traveled only found out about the Brooks criminal operation long after the executions. After the arrests, Brooks Inn was left empty and slowly fell apart over the next few years. People in the area stayed away from the property because of memories of the crimes that happened there. Eventually, the building fell down because it wasn't taken care of, and because of the weather in the Ozark Mountains. As part of the investigation, the authorities took apart the processing cabin, which was where the most disturbing parts of the crimes happened. Taking down the building was an effort to get rid of the physical evidence of the shocking crime that had taken place in the area. The people of Greene County took a long time to fully recover from the shock of the crimes. The fact that a seemingly respectable family ran a murder business made people wary and suspicious for a long time after the executions. The investigation found problems with the way different areas talked to each other, which let the crimes go on without being properly detected. Better coordination between local governments after this event helped keep similar things from happening in other rural parts of the Ozarks. People told the Brooks story around campfires and in local bars as a warning about how dangerous it is to trust strangers without thinking. People in the area told these stories to their children and grandchildren so that the lessons would never be lost. The case also showed how important it is to keep going with a criminal investigation. Clark's refusal to accept simple explanations and his willingness to follow disturbing evidence led to the discovery of an operation that could have gone on for much longer and killed more innocent people. The story of the Brooks family is a sad reminder of how hopelessness can destroy a person's soul. In a time when rural hospitality was necessary for travelers to stay alive, the Brooks turned this sacred tradition into a deadly trap. This legend still lives on in the Ozark valleys, warning people about hidden dangers behind normal-looking things. What makes this case so disturbing is how normal the operation seems to be. Like other inns of the time, Brooks Inn provided shelter and food for tired travelers. Finding out that this facade hid a murder operation showed a level of evil that went against what the community expected, and it left deep scars in the minds of everyone who lived there. Clark's investigation showed how important it is to be persistent and pay attention to small details when solving hard crimes. The refusal to accept simple explanations and the willingness to follow disturbing evidence to its logical conclusions led to the discovery of a criminal operation that could have gone on forever, taking more innocent lives. The case also shows how being far away from other people can make crimes last longer. Brooks Inn's remote location and the fact that its guests were only there for a short time made it possible for crimes to go unnoticed by police and local communities for months. This is a dark reminder of how vulnerable people were in the far-off lands of the American frontier. The way the community reacted to the crimes shows how people need to deal with and move past trauma as a group. The community's decision to leave the property and let it fall apart was a way for them to deal with memories that had shaken their faith in basic human nature. They wanted to erase all signs of a horror that was hard to understand. The most upsetting thing is that innocent guests ate human flesh without knowing it. This breach of fundamental trust introduces a level of horror that surpasses mere homicide, venturing into the territory of human dignity violation, an enduring nightmare that resonates through generations. The story is a warning about how important it is to be careful and how not all hospitality is given with good intentions. In a world where we often have to rely on the kindness of strangers, this story is still relevant as a reminder of the precautions we need to take. It is a dark whisper from the Ozarks that makes us question who we can really trust when we're far from home, vulnerable, and at the mercy of strangers. The Brooks family legend still haunts the Ozark valleys. It is a story told in low voices that will always remind people that the worst things often hide behind the friendliest smiles and most welcoming hospitality.